Phil, you want me to get you started?
Go ahead.
Good deal. We're delighted to have all y'all with us this morning. We actually are expecting maybe an overflow crowd, so that's the reason we put a few extra chairs out here. My name is David Breland. I am the manager of historic resources for the city. This is one of my museums. The other one is the Old State Bank. One thing that we do a lot of events every year. I'd say 100, 125 events that we do that have to do with history. One is History First. If you've never been to one of these are a lot of fun. We have guest speakers come in, and trust me, we have about 100 really first-rate historians in this town, in my opinion, in various fields. You know, I don't know of anybody that knows everything about everything. But if we want something on early Decatur or Native American stuff, here's your guy right here. That's part of my job, is to know who knows what and to plug them in. We've had some really great things this year. We've got some more coming up. I think we have our schedule filled through March with speakers. Most of them are the first Friday. Phil had a conflict, but we definitely wanted him to speak, so we moved his to the second Friday, obviously. But Phil Wirey is the vice president of Moore County Historical Society and really good historian. He's also, in my opinion, one of the county's cemetery experts. He does a lot of talks at City Cemetery and other cemeteries in town, so I think you're going to be quite interested. You're going to talk, I'm sure, some about the quad, which nobody knows about it, but you're about to know about it, which is a really neat thing. So be sure to come to our other First Friday ones. All of them are at 11 o'clock. It is very important that you make a reservation, because you can see this morning, we're just about full, and I anticipate, I know of a couple more that are supposed to be here, so we will be full if that happens. So let us know. We have generally limited space for folks here. So Phil, take it away. We're so glad you're here. And by the way, y'all look around the depot too as well when you get finished. Neat thing. One thing I'll tell you about tomorrow, we have something very, very special and a one-off thing. We have a local fella that has a world-class Elvis collection. If you're a fan of Elvis Presley, you're gonna come in here, your jaw's gonna hit the floor with some of the stuff you're gonna see.
I remember when he was on a train.
Oh, well, I was going, hey, you mean,
Everybody, all the girls, we all flocked down to the.
you mean it looked a little like that?
Yeah.
How about that?
Real ways on the train. Gotcha.
And let's
He
just
just
see.
came out on the platform.
Let's just see. Whose daddy is this? Raise your hand. Raise your hand. Hey, there's a good lesson to be learned from this. Everyone just assumed because Elvis came here with some frequency by train and came by car on occasion. Charlie Hodge, his running buddy, was a country music star, and Charlie was from Decatur. His mama lived on Wadsworth Street, close to, it was in the Mill Village, close to Goodyear Tire and Rubber Company. And so, everyone just kind of assumed, well, they got all kind of Elvis stuff. The truth is, I looked for 10 years, really, 10 years, trying to find a picture of Elvis here at the depot. And in it walked with her daddy shaking Elvis's hand.
Was that daddy?
That's Colonel Tom Parker, the notorious, he's a pretty notorious manager.
I'm a witness. That really happened.
Well, and the hummingbird. So pretty cool picture to have. And this was just because one of our citizens was gracious enough to walk in and say, kind of humbly, I know you must have a ton of these, but I have this. Oh my gosh, am I having a good day today? You'll see this again tomorrow. The fellow that has the Elvis collection has an autograph, several rare autographs from Decatur, but not a picture like this. He's going to put this picture with the autographs and some other things. But anyway, if you're an Elvis fan, sure enough, don't miss tomorrow morning between 9 and noon. These are things you will not see in a museum.
Here at the
anywhere.
depot?
Right here in this
So
room.
you'll clear out the chairs and put the display?
As soon as we're finished here, we're gonna clear this all out and we're gonna put in tables and, it's gonna be a great thing. Just give you one example. Elvis made, records when he was in the Army. Army was smart enough when he was drafted that, they didn't put him on front line somewhere. He was a great propagandist in a way and PR guy for the Army. So he cut some records for the Army that are one of a kinds. And this gentleman has quite a number of those, which, I mean, you'll never ever see those again, period. So spread the word, it's gonna be a pretty cool thing, Mark. Phil, take it away.
I'm glad he brought up the cemetery thing. I had a friend tell me the other day, says every time he passes by an old cemetery, he thinks of me. Now, I don't know if that's a compliment or...
Well, I'll simply say you're younger than me, so there you go.
Cemeteries are full of history.
Yeah, a few introductions before we get going. Most of y'all know Shirley Hammond, I guess. Shirley has kept the Morgan County Historical Society going all these many years. Her and her husband were the original founders. We've given out a Shirley Hammond Award most years. I think the last one we gave out was Bill Dennis.
Yep.
I don't know if y'all remember Bill Dennis. He was my Methodist historian from First Methodist Church. He passed away, moved back to Auburn, passed away probably about a year or so ago.
Mm-hmm.
But we also had Phil Foster here. I talk about that I've got the worst arrowhead collection in North Alabama. Phil's got one of the best in North Alabama. If he ever brings his out and shows it to people, we've seen it and took a look at it. I mentioned him because I'm going to be talking a lot about Monsanto. If you know the history of Monsanto, it started out as Kimstrand in the 1950s, went to Monsanto, then went to Solutia, and then went to Alventia, I guess is what it is now. And Phil was the plant manager at Solutia for a time, but you'll hear me talk about these great amateur archaeologists. You consider yourself an amateur archaeologist, I guess, but
Somewhere down the road below you.
we'll be talking about a lot of these people from Monsanto that you'll hear me mention. So, for those of y'all that don't know me, I'm one of the commissioners for the Decatur Historic Preservation Commission. I'm also a member of the Alabama Archaeological Society, and I attend the Coleman chapter along with Phil. We actually have 3 chapters in North Alabama. We've got one in Coleman, we've got one in Florence, and we've got one in Huntsville. So actually the first chapter started in December of 1954 here in Decatur. And we'll talk about a little bit of how the Alabama Archaeological Society got founded just here in Decatur. I'm also was a senior environmental engineer out at 3M. And no, I'm not going to talk about the lawsuit, with the city. That's all at 3. I've been retired since 2015 before all this kind of broke out, so which was a good thing for me, I guess. But I did spend a lot of time. I spent 36 years at 3M. So basically, I'm going to start with the 3M plant and use that to talk about some of the Native American and Native American sites that we have here. If I can get my pointer to work, this is an overview. Does that show up at all?
It goes on the wall just a
Yes.
second.
It does on the wall, but doesn't on the, we have, this is an overview from the Tennessee River of the 3M plant. You have the film plant, the chemical plant, the film plant. Indorama is shown on here and what I've outlined is the way the Tennessee River used to run before they put the dam in. And so many of y'all remember Baker's Creek or know Baker's Creek. The original name of that was Spring Hill Creek, and it would run along the base of 3M. And then over here at our river water pump house that we have is where we come into the Tennessee River. A little bit about the history of this area. It was settled back in 1820 by a guy named Banyan Payne. We've got a map of 1834 of the Decatur area. And west of it, there's only 2 places that are shown on that map. One of it's General Jesse Winston Garth's plantation along the Danville Road. The other one is Payne's Landing and Warehouse. So Banyan Payne came here from South Carolina, Georgia, before he finally settled here. Ended up going up to Memphis later. But this was kind of the main shipping area for the Trinity area. that would have material. And we call this Finley Island Road now. Round Island was actually located just south of the area. We know it as Finley Island now, but originally it was called Round Island. And John Winfield Scott Dancy was the first person to settle that. If you're familiar with the Dancy Poke House, it's next door here. That was his uncle that built that house, and John Winfield Scott Dancy married the daughter of Dr. Henry Rhodes. Y'all familiar with Dr. Henry Rhodes, Rhodes Ferry Park that we have here? And they lived there on the island. His wife, or the daughter of Dr. Henry Rhodes, passed away while they were living there, and she's actually, y'all know where the Lafayette Street Cemetery is, right up here? She's actually buried in that cemetery. Well, he would leave Decatur after she passed away and would go to Texas. He fought with Sam Houston. He's known as the father of the Texas railroads out there, but every so often he would come back to Decatur and he would sit in the Lafayette Street Cemetery and pine over his long-lost wife that he had, so he would come back and visit from time to time. But that's something about the early history of the area here. Back in the 1930s, there was a guy named Dr. William Webb from the University of Kentucky that was instructed to come down and survey a lot of these Indian sites before they put the Wheeler Dam in, because a lot of these sites were going to be covered up. And so what I've done is gone through and listed some of the sites that he came up with. We have, in the designation here, you can see one stands for Alabama, MG stands for Morton County, and then the number that's on we have what we call an Alabama State File List that's kept up with down in Mountville. And that's the number that was designated to some of these sites. And so we have some Mississippian sites over here we have about a 30-acre park that the 3M employees went through and developed, about 4 or 5 miles worth of walking trails. Along one of the walking trails, you can still see the remnants of some of these shell mounds from the Mississippian area. There was also an Indian village that was located here at Payne's Landing. There was also some burial sites that we'll talk about at Dr. Frank Sodé here in a minute that he discovered on Finley Island when he was here in the 50s. And there were some burial sites, and he unearthed some of the Indian burials that was there.
So how do you access that Indian park?
Right now, you have to know somebody like me to get into the park.
He's not open to the public.
I think I've got my 3M card. They still let me get in from time to time.
Fun to do.
Yeah. And here we have what we call the Cameron site. This is our wastewater treatment plant here at the Cameron site, what he called 53. They call MG 324 site was middle woodland or predominantly what they call a capina site. Capina is just a combination of two words, copper and galena. Galena is like a lead oxide that the Indians used to use to put on war paint. That was during that time. And we'll talk about what each of these different, when we say woodland, Mississippian areas. Jack Cameron, again, we'll talk about him a little bit when we talk about the Archaeological Society. The main thing I wanted to point out was the Nebo Hill site, which was located here. Now this is a paleo site. Paleo sites go back anywhere from 12,000 back to 30,000 years ago. Okay, and it was discovered by a guy named Samuel Mosley. Samuel Mosley was another one of these engineers that worked at Monsanto, and 3M up until 79 had cabins that they would rent out here. Well, back in the 50s, Samuel Mosley, he would have a little boat. He'd boat over to Monsanto and come back, and on his way back he'd hunt for arrowheads on so he discovered the Nebo Hill site, which this is the Dyken area, and right at the corner of Dyken's property on 3M property there was the Nebo Hill site. How do we know where the Nebo Hill site was? Well, he gives a description in the report that he did back in the 1950s, and it says Nebo Hill is before you get to Finley Island. Again, Finley Island is here. You got State Docks Road, and there was this road called Nebo Lane that came here. It said there was a road that went in. Nebo Church was on that road. It was a black church, and right across the road from this black church, the land sort of fell off, and that's where the site was. So that's how we can identify if you see this 1918 picture, it shows exactly where the Nebo Church was. So we know right across the road from the Nebo lane that came in here was where the Nebo Hill site was. And I was working, just got approval from the archaeological site down in Moundville to get this classified. They had heard about the Nebo Hill site, but they didn't know where it was. And so I worked with a lady named Jan Jameson and did the documentation, and now it's part of the archaeological state file that we have. And if you look at it, the number is 1,071. What that means is there's over 1,000 different Indian sites located just here in Morgan County that's been classified in their state file. Now, they won't let you see that state file because they're afraid people will see where they are and go and try to hunt on it and that sort of thing. But they have it documented. If you're in the profession, they'll let you have access. You have to go to Moundville and you can look and see some of the documentation. But what's kind of surprised me when we got the results back and that we were on the Alabama state file list was the number of sites. That kind of surprised me a little bit, that there were that many just here in Morgan County. So anywhere you walk, you'll probably be stumbling into a Native American site here in Morgan County. Any questions on that? And this is real informal, that if you have questions, feel free to interrupt me, talk, that sort of thing. We actually have the artifacts that Samuel Mosley collected off the Nebo Hill site. One of the gentlemen that Phil and I have worked with before is Dr. Hoyt Price, that's a member of the Coleman Society down there, and he actually purchased the Nebo Hill site artifacts from the Samuel Mosley family that was here. We talked about that the Alabama Archaeological Society was founded here in Decatur. How many of y'all remember where the old DU building was on Johnson Street? Okay, they've recently just tore it down and putting up the dormitories for the new college there. Well, on the second floor, that's where they would meet, and they met for the first time back in 1955. Some of the people that you see here, number 2 listed, that's Samuel Mosley that we talked about. Again, one of these engineers from Monsanto. The well-dressed gentleman here in the back, Ed Mahan, he kind of collected over in the Gunnersville, Madison area. He was actually born in Honduras. His parents died there. He was orphaned, came back to Montgomery, and then ended up in North Alabama, where he was monumental in there. I've got 2 daughters, so I like to talk about women and their history that they had. We had a couple of women that were involved in the early Alabama Archaeological Society. Georgia Dunn, that you see here, was the postmaster over in Lacey Springs. She was also, I believe she taught for a while over in that area. There's a book, it was a national book, it's called The Who's Who in Indian Relics. And she made volume 4 on there. They've got a nice bio on her. If you go to the archives, and I would invite anybody to, we're getting a collection of different artifacts at the archives, but one of the things they have on display now is her arrowheads that she collected here in North Alabama. So you can stop by there and see her collection. You also have number 9 there, which is, I'm going to get her name wrong here, Mildred Chenault. I don't know if any of y'all knew Mildred Chenault. That was a school teacher. You probably know her son, Ellis Chenault, that was a photographer here in town. But she was also one of the early members. You see a picture here of Jack Cameron we talked about earlier. He and Dr. Frank Sodé, that we'll talk about, actually put together the Alabama of Alabama Archaeology back in the 1960s. And that is the book that most archaeologists, at least here in the Southeast, use to identify all the different type points that we have. You can see Chick Craig that's here was another one of these Monsanto engineers. You've got Dick Rather, or let me see, Dick Radford that's here was another one of our military veterans that was also an engineer at Monsanto. And then here in the back, number 13, is Dr. Frank Sodé. How many people have heard of Dr. Frank Sodé? Anybody? A few people. You probably don't know him, but you probably know one of his inventions. AstroTurf. He probably had over 100 different patents. A brilliant man.
Monsanto.
Was the vice president of research out at Monsanto, or at that time it was Chemstran, and had a number of different patents. But he is pretty much the brains and the founder of the Alabama Archaeological Society. He was the first president. He had studied and he had worked at what we call the Chute site up in Pennsylvania. He had done a lot of excavations down in Ohio before coming to Alabama. So he had a pretty good understanding of archaeology and some of the point types. And it was essentially why there was this big group of Monsanto people that were involved in it, because they were kind of students of Dr. Frank Sodé, and we'll talk a little bit more about him.
Is it possible that James Cameron, Doris Cameron was his wife, maybe?
I think it was. Doris was his
Yeah, we
wife.
went to church with Doris for years,
Oh, okay.
but Jack was gone shortly after we,
Yeah. He worked, I think, for Decatur Daily, and he had a printing company, or worked for a printing company also, and so he was well versed in putting publications together like that. So it's and it was essentially him, and we've got some pictures of Dr. Frank Sodé. They actually lived up here on the street next to Vine Street,
yeah.
and that's where Dr. Frank Sodé lived, and in their basement is where they had like hundreds and hundreds of these artifacts that they would go through and classify. This is a number from the a picture from the 1957 meeting that they had. You had Brent Thompson, who was actually from Birmingham, was getting their chapter started. So Brent Thompson kind of started their chapter, along with Dan Jocelyn, who was another publisher that put together these memorial publications and that sort of thing for the different archaeology groups for a number of years. Their first speaker that you see here was Walter B. Jones. Walter B. Jones headed up Moundsville for years, and we'll talk about William Webb. He actually worked with...
Moundsville t-shirt.
Yeah. He actually loved archaeology. He loved mining for gold, too. So you have a picture of him and his wife where they're sitting there panhandling for gold here in Alabama also. And again, Jack Cameron you see here. You see Chick that we talked about from Monsanto. Samuel Mosley again. Another woman, Doreen Hindle that you see there, her husband Walter was one of the big wigs for Monsanto. And they would go out on the weekend, again influenced by Dr. Frank Sodé, and do search for a number. We've got some great pictures of them and some of the digs that they went on. What's really neat is they had a field notebook that's actually at the Museum of the American Indian up in Washington, D.C. So you can actually go online, pull it up, and it's got all these great descriptions of places they searched here in Decatur, and info on the work that they did while they were here in Decatur. So some of the early members and officers that we had for them. I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the Native Americans. I refer to these as Indians. Indians really don't like the term Native Americans, or a lot of them don't. They prefer to be called Indians because that's what they were called. All the Native Americans is just something for Americans, kind of happy to make them feel better. That we took away your land, but we gave you a nice title and place. But so you'll hear me talk about Indian artifacts. I don't mean that in derogative at all. These are the different Native American periods that we talk about. Paleo Indians, again, were the first Native Americans that we had here. Most people term about 14,000 years ago. I think it probably goes back even further because of some discoveries that they made off the Atlantic coast. Probably goes back maybe 30,000 years. So well, I think we had an influence not only from Asia of Native Americans, but also from Europe along the borders of the Ice Age that was kind of going away about 12,000 years ago. So we refer to the Paleo Indians, and it's points like the Clovis Point. If you've heard about the Clovis Point, Cumberland Points, those are very early Native American points that we have. And BP, we say 14,000 years. BP just means before present. Okay, so and before present is defined as 1955. So if you want to remember, I was born in 1955, so you can say that BP stands for Phil, but you know. How's my jokes doing? Is that they don't get very much better, but the next period is the Archaic period. We actually have one of the Archaic points that's shown up there, the Decatur Point, that was named for the city of Decatur, that was here. You've got the Woodland period. The Oakville Indian mounds were some of the earliest mounds going back 2,000-3,000 years that would be defined as the woodland area. So that was kind of the first of the mound building. Mississippian is mainly known for its mounds. So we'll talk about the mound that we had here in Decatur. It was a Mississippian mound that we had going back 2,000 years. And then historic. Historic normally just refers to the Native Americans we're familiar with, the Chickasaw, the Cherokee, the Creek Indians, the Yuchi Indians that we'll talk about who were native here to Decatur. We've got a number of collections at the Morgan County Archives. Maurice Jones, or all his friends called him Moose, we've got his collection at the archives, and Phil Foster and I and some guys from Coleman came up and went and classified the different 90 artifacts that we have there. So we've been working with Senator Arthur Orr, and hopefully we can get a better display. We've got one display of our Native American artifacts, but we're hoping to get a much bigger one that we can show off some of Moose's material. Many of y'all know Dr. Bill Sims, that has a bike trail, you know, that's named for him, that he gave his collection to the archives. These were ones that were found back in the early 1800s that he purchased, and then he gave to the Morgan County Archives. So, yeah.
The different eras that you have here, are these people connected genetically? I mean, is it just a newer group, or are they completely different?
I don't know. I would say that they're from the same early, all descended from Paleo Indians that came down years ago.
So they're all one big family, they just
Yeah.
have different eras.
And there's some genetics that's been done on Native Americans, and there's basically 2 or 3, I don't know what they call genogroups that they come from. And one of the genogroups they're finding is they found that same genogroup over in Europe. So that's why I'm saying I think they came from 2 different directions. It might have actually, you know, how did Hawaii get populated? It may have some actually came by boat also, you know, down to the South American area. So anyway.
Can I ask what makes that Decatur Point specific?
Bill, you want to answer that question? I'm going to take all the easy questions, and I'm going to answer the,
That's why I'm not here,
sure.
so y'all can't see me to ask
It probably has something to do with the wings that are on here. Okay. It's not a fluted point. This is actually a point that came from 3M, that base of a Cumberland. On Cumberland Point, they're actually fluted down the middle. So that classifies some are fluted. A lot of these from the Archaic period, I don't know that there's any fluted points from the Archaic period. They're mostly these wing type points that we have here. But I'm kind of, when you talk about amateur archaeologists, I'm a real amateur archaeologist. There's people that know a lot more about these. I'm always amazed when I go down to Coleman, and one of the things I enjoy going to the meetings is just hearing some of the knowledge of the people that have been working on this for 50 years.
And that material of the Decatur Point, it looks green, but is it flint?
That's flint.
Okay.
Yeah, all these points, you can see there's different colors. There's different colors of flint. You can see some of them that I have over there. You know, some of it's like a brown flint, some of it's more of a grayish type. And I don't know, there's probably 4 or 5 major classifications of flint that people talk about. So, any other questions about that? This is one of the questions that I talk about, religious questions, that I gave this talk at the Decatur Rotary, and I had about 25 minutes to give an hour presentation, so I had to rush through it. But one of the questions came up with one of the guys that says, well, you know, he was one of these young earth Christians, and he says, well, you know, because we're talking about, you know, we just celebrated the Hebrew New Year, which is, this is the year, as far as the Hebrew is 5784, and 5784 goes back to the creation of Adam. And he said, well, how does all this fit in? If you're talking about, that would have been, you know, kind of the middle of the Archaic period, and I said, I don't know. All I can say is that this is what most archaeologists look at as far as these different periods. It's there. So.
Yeah, if you're
Good
interested in
question
the
for
creation, the Creation Museum and the Ark Encounter, they can shed a lot of light on the young Earth view and back it up scientifically if you're interested in that. A lot of people think it's, you know, not a thing, but it's a thing.
Yeah.
Well, I know in Oakville, the archaeologists there, they got permission to dig up 2 graves. And, you know, there's a new Native American grave, something that has real strict things now. All they could do was take one photograph. They had to rebury it, but one of them was a 2,000-year-old Indian female. And
that was on the main mound.
That was on the big platform mound.
They've got actually 2 mounds that are out
And
there.
then they found a slave that was dated, but they carbon date them, so that's how they get the year, and it was 2000.
Yeah.
So it is factually backed up by data now. A lot of new technology.
So, any other questions? I'm going to talk a little bit about the quad. Anybody ever heard of the quad? I know Phil has, and I know there's a few people that have, but that's probably the most historic site that we have here in the city of Decatur that nobody's ever heard of. Okay, it's the first Paleo-Indian site, not just in Decatur or Alabama, but in the whole southeast that was discovered in December of 1951. Okay, and if you go across the river bridge here, and once you get to the other side of the river, if you look off to the right, this is the area of the quad. And there was a number of different artifacts that Dr. Frank Sode and his nephew, Dr. Jerry Carr, discovered back in December of 1954, or 1951. So that was, again, that's what's fascinating about that. Nobody ever thought there were Paleo-Indians in the southeast. There were some out in Arizona, there were some up in Pennsylvania, but none had ever been discovered here in the southeast. So this is the first. The Nebo Hill site that I talked about was the second Paleo-Indian site that was discovered here in Decatur and in Alabama. But again, it was discovered in December of 1951. Dr. Frank Sode is an interesting story. His wife, Myrtle, and again, they lived here in Old Decatur. Myrtle couldn't have any children, okay? But her sister, Sarah Fry Carr here that you see, she was a kind of a starving artist in Columbus, Ohio. She had 5 kids, and so she wrote to Myrtle and said, look, you don't have any kids, I got 5, take one of mine. And so that's what happened, is that Jerry Carr absolutely loved coming down there. Again, he was from a poor family in Columbus, Ohio. He came down here to Decatur living with his rich uncle, you know, in downtown. He went to Decatur High School, graduated, went on to the University of Alabama. He kind of had an interest. We interviewed him probably a couple of years ago. He just passed away about a year ago. But he was a professor at a number of different colleges throughout the United States and was involved with a lot of different social demonstrations, whether it's civil rights, whether it was war demonstrations, that sort of thing. But it's one of the reasons he kept getting fired from a lot of the different colleges because of his social activities that he had. And he ended up in Chapel Hill, where he retired at. And he didn't feel right about having these artifacts that he collected at while he was here in Decatur with his uncle. And he absolutely loved going out on the river with his uncle, hunting arrowheads and artifacts. But one of the points that they have, and we defined, is the quad point that Jack Cameron and Dr. Frank Sode defined. And again, it's similar to these wings. And again, I don't know that much about the different types, but we do know that Dr. Sode collected over 20,000 artifacts off the quad. Think about that, 20,000 that he had. Most of those artifacts are now at the Gilcrease Indian Museum down in Tulsa, Oklahoma. Jerry Carr, again, didn't feel right about keeping his collection, so he donated that to the Chota Indian tribe down in Faulkner. And you can actually go, if you ever get into the history museum that they've got down at the Chota Indian tribe. Phil and I went down there about a year ago, I guess, and they've got his display and his artifacts on location. Now, there was some talk with them that one of the ladies that lives down in Birmingham as part of that tribe she was thinking it'd be nice to donate those to the Morgan County Archives where more people could view them. But I don't know if that'll ever happen or not. But
Well, with the paleo, which is the earliest group, are you just finding points, or are you finding other types of artifacts?
mainly points. You didn't really get into bowls, and those are plain stones. One of the things we found out at 3M was that the Nebo Hill site was a plain stone that was about that round and about that wide, and Native Americans would, roll it toward a target and that sort of thing. And so you find those, but that normally comes later. And the bowls that Samuel Mosley that we talked about, he found a nice pottery bowl that he pieced back together from the Nebo Hill site. So, but that normally comes from the Woodland or Mississippian area when you start finding that.
Do you
And we'll
think
show
Those
you
are
examples.
those up in the upper right-hand corner. I mean, those scrapers,
Yeah.
and there's used for etching and awls, and a lot of that stuff that's paleo.
Yeah.
And
Drills
the
they would
tools,
use.
exactly.
Yeah.
So a lot of tools and things other than points are from that same paleo period, found in the same locations.
Yeah, and this is an example of a scraper or that I found out at 3M. So it's just not arrowheads that you see here, but there's different scrapers
Because they
or
were
different
mainly
things
used for
like that.
hunting, right? The
Arrowheads.
Pods and so forth.
Yeah, so they were not, a lot of people think of them as arrowheads,
Yeah.
but the
Really
weapons
spearheads.
changed over all those
Yeah.
periods of time. That's the reason they tended to get smaller and more ornate, and because the arrow wasn't even introduced till later. These were probably spear points, knives,
Yeah.
lance later, and then arrowheads.
Do you
So
think-
And I think I've got one here that would be kind of termed as an arrowhead. It's very small, that it's kind of an area that maybe come from like a historic area, while these others were more spear points, or they would use what they call an atlatl that go on the end of the spear, and they would be able to throw it and project it with. So.
Do you
And the
think
thing
we,
is, if we found things like that, to me, it's just a rock.
I know,
Yeah.
it's hard to.
That's why you need professionals
It
to
makes
do
me
it.
wonder, how many things have I run across in my life that I thought were just rocks?
Well, I tell people I've got one bad habit. The other bad habit I got's lying, but I'm a smoker, so I was at the hospital with some of my in-laws, and so I walked out underneath the tree and smoked a cigarette there outside, and looked down, and there's an arrowhead laying there. And I thought, man, you just find these things everywhere. So,
Like I
they were
said, to me, it's a rock.
rich settlement of Indians.
and most of your collection you got up in Tennessee, right? When you were a young boy, you hunted and
about
found.
half, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, do we have any rights to ever bring back the Sodays, Oklahoma things and put them in a museum here? They really belong here.
Well, yeah, which some of his collection, because he went through and dug up some of these burial sites,
Yeah.
some of his collection he got donated back to the Indian tribes
Okay.
because he had. But I doubt that the Gilcrease Indian Museum would give up the collection they have there. Yeah,
So the 20,000 pieces, were they all from this area?
right. All from the quad.
Wow.
He collected probably 40,000 in his time that he was here. 20,000 of those came from the quad. So he was one that really liked and spent a lot of time out on the quad.
Well, what do we know about the quad as far as the culture and what brought that many, obviously?
The hunting ground, there's, you know, you had the mussel shows. We talked about the mussel shows that's here, right? Well, that was kind of a barrier for animal travel. Okay, so where you find most of these artifacts is on either side of the mussel shows. So you would have places like the salt licks that were up in Nashville, where you had these animals that would go to the salt licks and then they migrate to the end of Morgan County. You know, we're kind of in a bowl here where the mountains come up, and so this migration that would go on each year, you know, you'd have these Native Americans that would follow and hunt from them. So we don't find a lot of things at the quad as far as habitation. It's more of a hunting ground that we have. Now, some of these African American or Native American sites, you can tell there was a habitation that was going, that they would stay there year after year. But this appears to be more of a hunting site.
I think that's
you know,
what
as they would
our
cross the
river
river.
was known to be an Indian hunting grounds. It was where they protected it for hunting and fishing for thousands of years, I
Yeah.
think. That's why it's so rich in all these areas.
Did you say that the Chota and Fayetteville have a museum that's open to be
It wasn't, and I probably shouldn't talk too much, but they got into some sort of
Yeah, okay. That's
of
right.
trouble,
Right.
and it used to be open like Wednesday through Saturday. It's kind of hard to find. You know,
I've been
it
there.
took us a while to kind of find the museum and during the festival they had. But each year they have a big festival they put on. I think they just had it
They
here.
just had it,
sometime.
I went to it.
Yeah. Well, did you go in the museum that they got
Part of it, yeah, some of it was closed. You know, they closed the headquarters down, I think, during the pandemic years, so
Yeah.
they're just kind of but they have meetings out there. There's 7 clans in the Achota tribe. You know, they're deer, wild potato,
Yeah.
all these different names. It's fascinating, but yeah, it's not real big.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, their museum part
Probably
that
the
they
best time
have
to
is
go
probably
is
about
during
the size of
the
this room.
powwow, which means festival.
But most of what they have in there, from what I remember, Phil, was the Jerry Carr collection. Is what they have in there.
That's good to know.
So here's a number of artifacts that are there. Any other questions?
Okay, I'm bad with geography. Where is this quad site? Where is that
When you
area
go-
located? I see the river and I see a road there.
Yeah, that's the bridge that goes across to Huntsville.
See, I said I was bad.
The Huntsville
Okay.
that you said, you know, there's the little park that's here.
Yes.
Right across, you know, and I would love to see a historical marker put in that park there, designated place. Nobody knows about where the quad is, but when you're going across the bridge, after you pass this island that's there on the Tennessee, just look out through here and that's the quad site.
Yes.
It was actually 3 different sites that made up the quad site. It was Stone Pipe, Pine Tree, and then the quad that's down here. And they divided the site up between these amateur archaeologists in Monsanto so they could be better investigated. So Jack Cameron had the Pine site, Soday had quad, you know, there's other people that had the Stone Pipe site, so.
And you also have to remember that when TVA changed the water level, I mean, all of the river was very shallow. I think it was 4
Yeah.
feet deep.
Yeah, all these
And it
islands have been
spread
washed
out.
away now, so these were very prominent islands and you could see them, you know, and people would go out and camp out on these islands out there, but they've been washed away now. Especially back in 1960, when Wheeler Dam broke and the water level dropped, well, that was a heyday for these amateur archaeologists to go out and hunt these areas. But now you can't see any of the islands that are out here, so they've been pretty much washed away.
Do you get close from some of the walking trails from 20?
I haven't been
The
down any of those walking
White
trails.
Station, is that what it's called? That's the best one probably.
I've never walked there, but I've seen it. I'm like, oh,
It's
it's
called,
cool.
I think, White
But
Station.
It's on
it's-
the refuge.
Yeah.
It's refuge.
It's
You know,
public.
starting about 1985, I guess, they made it illegal to hunt on federal
It
lands
is.
with arrowheads. So, now, in fact, every now and then, this one was a couple of years ago, you'll see somebody that's drowned out on the quad site that was in the middle of the winter in a kayak. And
Oh,
what they're doing is out there at night hunting for arrowheads.
And I think the
not getting caught, and the
I-65
boat
bridge
turns over,
is
it's
a
cold,
big
and they end up
searching
running.
area.
So,
That's great.
well, let me talk a little bit about Decatur and some of the Indian mounds we had. And back in, again, the 1930s, William Snyder Webb from the University of Kentucky came down and identified over 60 sites in 5 Indian mounds here in Morgan County, in the area. Again, some of them we pointed out were out at 3M. One of these was at the Stone Lumber Company. Y'all familiar with Bill Stone and Stone Lumber Company? If you go down Market Street, you'll see the big building that says Stone Lumber Company on it there. Well, that was one of the, it was originally started by a guy named Herman Hitt. And Herman Hitt came here from Illinois, started that lumber company out there. He actually had his office across the street here. How many of y'all remember the police station, fire station, city hall that was right across the parking lot that was here? Up on the second floor, they rented those out to businesses. That's where he had his office out. But the Stone family ended up buying the Hitt Lumber Company. And here you can see the pictures they took back in 1939 of the work they were doing on the lumber company. And you can see the Tennessee River Bridge that goes across here. So it was located just here on the Tennessee River. And we had another one that they located down, if you go down Highway 31 and then turn on Red Bank Road, and then you cross Flint Creek. Well, south of there, at that intersection, there was another Indian mound. That was more of a burial mound that they had there. But now when they put the dam in, that was all went away. It got covered up in water. So, and this one was pretty much, with all the digging and searching that they did, it was pretty much destroyed. I
So
told Bill's,
the different levels on the Stone Lumber Company slide, that's from the excavation?
that's from the excavation
Okay.
they did. So they would, you know, I told Bill Stone, I said, one of the things on my bucket list is to go and stand on the site where the Indian mound was, but he said it's all grown up, that he wouldn't know exactly where it was
Where it
located
was.
at anyway. But there, what they did find there, you know, you were talking about different artifacts. They did find things like pottery that they, when they dug in, they didn't find any burials in here, but they did find pottery. And I think it was used by some of the historic tribes too. Here's a couple sisters that belonged to the Yuchi Indian tribe. The Yuchi Indians were probably some of the most ancient, as far as their language anyway, ancient historic Indians that we had here. And we'll talk a little bit more about the Yuchi Indians. But they were called the Children of the Sun, and they were mound worshipers too. So I think that even though they probably didn't build, maybe their ancestors did, but they probably didn't build the mound. They used the mound for different activities and that sort of thing they had here, because the Yuchis were ones that did use mounds. So those are 2 of those that we have here in Decatur, 2 of the 5 mounds that were located here in Morgan County and in Decatur. Any questions about that? And I've listed some of the things they found. Again, flint spalls, broken flint, scrapers, and knives that they did uncover when they went through. And
Obviously, some remains down there at Red Bank Road and Flint Creek.
yeah, that was some of the burials that they. Now, what they did with the bones and what they did with the artifacts, I'm thinking they might have taken those back to the University of Kentucky when Snyder Webb.
Well, the Native Americans are suing the University of Alabama archaeology and history because they're sacred objects to their ancestors, which, you know, you can see both sides.
Yeah.
Somebody's preserved the history, but they were. But a lot of the mounds, from what I've learned, is that they were ceremonial more than, and usually just the burial, like at Moundville, they're mainly for the
So
high
that's what
chiefs.
surprised us about Moundville when they found that burial, because no one had ever thought there was a
It
burial
was just like the
on
high
the big
chief
mound.
people.
No, there was another smaller mound there at
Yeah,
Moundville
but
that did
most
have a
of-
lot of
yeah,
burials, but the big one, they always thought was just ceremony until they found the lady that was buried on top of that. So. This is a map that I use, and I apologize because it's kind of awful busy. But it's a good speed map from 1886, and it kind of shows where the early settlers of Decatur came from in East Tennessee. I have highlighted here Clinton. Why is Clinton so important on this map?
Your hometown?
It's my hometown. And if you're a big fan of the Old State Bank, it's also the hometown of Dr. John Sutherland. And his father had a ferry that went across the Clinch River. Back then it was called the Pellissippi River. And he would come from Clinton and was the first president of the Old State Bank. If you've ever toured down the Old State Bank, you'll see a picture of him. He was also known as the messenger of the Alamo. He left here, went to the Alamo. He was the one that reported to Sam Houston the massacre that occurred, and that's how he got the title, the messenger of the Alamo. But on it, there's a number of different points that you see here. White's Fort that we see here is what is now called Knoxville. Governor's Station is the home of John Sevier. Governor John Sevier was one of the first governors of the state of Tennessee and also the state of Franklin. His place, Marble Springs, is still open. They've made a museum out of it. You can tour through Marble Springs. But I mention him because he was the one under George Washington's administration that attacked all the Indian villages that were located here along the Little Tennessee River. And from that, there was a Cherokee Indian named Conatu that decided, look, I've had enough of these white settlers. The Spanish government on the other side of the Mississippi is inviting us to come out and live. So that was the first Cherokee migration that occurred from East Tennessee out to Oklahoma and Arkansas. We'll talk about some of the other migrations here in a minute, but one of the interesting things when it comes to the Trail of Tears, a third of the Cherokee Nation was already living out in Oklahoma before the Trail of Tears occurred. So you had a third out there, you had 2/3 here in East Tennessee, Georgia, and Alabama. But now, as far as Indian removal, the first Indian removal that actually occurred was over 1,000 years ago, and this area was populated by the Yuchi Indians that we talked about earlier. Now, the Yuchi Indians were mainly farmers. The men were probably 5'5", so they were a small group. And I don't know if you've ever heard of the Iroquois Nation that was up in New York, and the 5 Iroquois tribes. There was actually 7 Iroquois tribes that were up there. 1,000 years ago, 2 of those broke off. The Tuscarora went to North Carolina, eastern North Carolina, and the Cherokee that was part of that came to East Tennessee. And they pretty much annihilated the Yuchi Indians that were here in East Tennessee and took over this area. The remnants of the Yuchi tribe in East Tennessee and Alabama would end up combining to greatly reduce their numbers, but they would end up combining with the Creek Indian Nation before they went to Oklahoma. So, any questions about, and a lot of these, Stephen Hurd came from my hometown. He was one of the early judges. John Menifee was one of the early judges in Morgan County also. He had a place called Menifee Station here. Black Fox, we'll talk about, was born around in this area. Major Ridge, which I've got a picture of there, is born in this area, and a lot of those would migrate down to either Georgia or Tennessee. This is the other map, and again, I pulled from that first map where some of these people from East Tennessee ended up settling here in North Alabama. And again, you can see the early map we have. You can see how the muscle shows is spelled. It's spelled like the muscle in your arm.
1806 is when they changed it. So that was 1816.
Okay. And in it, I'll talk about Andrew Jackson here in a minute. I call Andrew Jackson our first president, Alabama's first president. And while he had one plantation up in Nashville, he actually had 2 plantations, one at Melton Bluff here, and then one at York Bluff, or a place called Jackson Hollow. So I say I get to claim Andrew Jackson because he had 2 plantations here in North Alabama. But some of the areas, like shows on the map, if you look at Mallard Creek that's listed here, it wasn't called Mallet Creek, it was called Mallet, like Indian Mallet. Fox's Creek, this is an area where Black Fox, when he came down from East Tennessee, had an Indian village on Fox's Creek. We call it Fox Creek now, it was called Fox's Creek. There was a lady that came from Washington, D.C., Ann Royal, that's shown here, and she actually interviewed Andrew Jackson at Mountains Bluff when he was there. And then she went to the Indian village at Fox's Creek and interviewed and talked to the different Native Americans that were living there. She was kind of known in Washington as the first female journalist, and she traveled all over the Southeast. There's an interesting story about John Quincy Adams that she wanted to interview when he was president in Washington, D.C., and he wouldn't give her an interview. And so one of the things John Quincy Adams would do each day would walk down from the White House, strip naked, and bathe in the Potomac River. And so what she did was she went and sat on his clothes. And wouldn't let him out of the water, until she gave him an interview. So he was waist deep in the Potomac River, gave her the interview, and then she got up, got dressed and went on back to the White House. So she was an interesting lady.
To 3M, Mallet Creek is to the west.
Yeah, Mallet Creek, Fox's Creek, Spring Hill Creek is all the way.
Hillsborough?
Yeah.
Yeah, Hillsborough there.
Trinity
That's what I
Time.
thought.
Yeah. So.
And there were a lot of ferries that crossed. I know there's one called Brown's Ferry
Yeah.
that,
Now this map was done by a guy named Major John Hutchings for John Coffey. John Coffey was one of the generals that Andrew Jackson gave, and Major John Hutchings was actually the nephew of General Andrew Jackson. Okay. Now this whole area here that we have from Morgan County was actually claimed by both the Cherokee and the Chickasaw. So the Cherokee claimed all the way over to this line here coming down from Caney Creek back, and the Chickasaw claimed land all the way over here to the Chickasaw fields back. So one of the things which Andrew Jackson didn't like was he had to sign 2 treaties when they got the treaty signed to obtain the land for Morgan County. Again, one with the Chickasaw and one with the Cherokee. So he essentially had to pay twice for the same land that he had here. But that opened it up in 1816. We also have a place called Hutchings Bluff that's shown on there. Anybody ever been to Hutchings Bluff? Well, you're sitting right in the middle of it.
I was gonna have to say, not knowingly.
So it was, that's the first designation we see of an area where Decatur is now located. It was called Hutchings Bluff, named for Major John Hutchings. We also, and we'll talk about here in a minute, the only name in the map that's shown here is Captain George Fields, which is a Cherokee Indian we'll talk a little bit about. He's the only one that's shown in Morgan County as far as one of the residents during this 1816 period. And if you recognize this guy, this is again Phil Foster. Phil and I actually, Major John Hutchings is actually buried over here around Harvest. And Phil and I, it took us 2 trips, but we finally found his gravesite that was located up there. The monument that you see here was actually produced by Andrew Jackson. Him and his wife came down and put that monument in place when again, their nephew, and they made a trip down here especially for that, for a ceremony for Major John
is
Hutchings.
that on public land or private land?
It's on private land, but the people that own it, I've forgotten what the name of the farm is there, that they don't have an objection for people.
But they know that.
Yeah, they know a lot of times they have a lock on the gate to where it's hard to go find, but we never had any trouble getting in. But anyway, that's and Phil Foster, he was actually related to Major John Hutchings, so that's where Phil's interest came in, trying to find some of his I'm not embarrassing you too much, am I? Is that-
You've done a great job.
The other person we talked about was Captain George Fields. Captain George Fields was a Cherokee Indian and fought with Andrew Jackson during the Creek Indian War. Him and his brother Turtle Fields, I like the name Turtle Fields. Turtle Fields was a Cherokee missionary to the Cherokee people, and both of them fought and were wounded in the Creek Indian War. Again, he lived around Lacey Springs. Afterwards, he would move to Gunnersville. His wife was, I call her Sally Fields, the other Sally Fields. Those two portraits that were there were actually done when they were visiting Andrew Jackson in Washington, D.C. But we'll talk a little bit more about him as far as some of the voluntary movements for the Cherokee when they went to Oklahoma. His son would end up becoming a judge for the Chief Justice of the Cherokee Supreme Court when they got out to Oklahoma. But that was one of our, and the only original native that we've been able to find that early for Morgan County. Now this is where I'm going to get in trouble because I'm going to go through and give some opinions I have, and one of them is my rating of American presidents. Has anybody ever done that? Who your favorite presidents are? Have you ever? I'm the only one that has enough time to sit around and do stuff like that.
I mean, I have many opinions since I've gotten older and learned history, yeah.
Well, this is kind of my list of my favorite presidents. Andrew Jackson by far is probably my favorite president. Thomas Jefferson, then Abraham Lincoln, George Washington, and then Ulysses S. Grant. Just to give you an idea, we just got back from Washington, D.C., where we took my granddaughter and toured through. We turned through all the different monuments that are there. Which of those names were the first monument to ever go up in Washington, D.C.?
Jefferson,
You would think it'd be Jefferson or Washington or not, but the first monument to ever be put up in Washington, D.C. was that of Andrew Jackson. If you go to Lafayette Square, and it was put up 25 years after he became president, so you can see just how popular that he was even 25 years after he was president there, that to be the first monument ever erected in Washington. Extremely popular back in his time. The hero of New Orleans. He was the only president, never has been done before and never has been done after, to completely pay off the national debt. You know, we talk about, and we slap Bill Clinton on the back saying, hey, you balanced the budget. He not only balanced the budget, but Andrew Jackson paid off the national debt. I don't think
he was told to do it, that was his job, but he did take a lot of land away from the Native Americans.
And that's one of the things
that bothers me.
I talk about is what the national policy was as far as
you have to
manifest
have
estimate.
context.
And just to show you how popular he was, even in the 1920s, this was where people rated the presidents, and Andrew Jackson was number 4 behind George Washington, Abraham Lincoln, and Thomas Jefferson, as far as three names. And how many people have ever been to Mount Rushmore? Got a few. Well, these were the 4 that were supposed to be on Mount Rushmore.
No.
Okay. But Calvin Coolidge, which he thought George Washington was a Democrat, he wasn't, he was a Federalist, but Calvin Coolidge said, yeah, I'm going to fund Mount Rushmore, but you're not going to have 3 Democrats and only 1 Republican up there. So you're going to have to take one of those Democrats off and put a Republican up there. So 5th on the list was Theodore Roosevelt, so Andrew Jackson got dropped off and Theodore Roosevelt got up. So that's why we have the 4 presidents that we have there. Now, one of the things that, you know, if you look at one of the statements here, the removal of the tribes from the territory which they now inhabit would not only shield them from impending ruin, but promote their welfare and happiness. Talking about the Indians. Experience has clearly demonstrated that in their present state, it's impossible to incorporate them in such masses in any form, whatever, into our system. Now that sounds something like Andrew Jackson would say, right? But that's actually a quote from 1825 from James Monroe. James Monroe is important to Decatur because he was the one that authorized or told the people in Huntsville to build a city called Decatur here. So one of the comments I'm going to make is that Indian removal was not an Andrew Jackson policy. It was a national policy. From George Washington all the way through to Theodore Roosevelt. Theodore Roosevelt once said when it came to 90% of the Indians, the best Indian was a dead Indian. Andrew Jackson would never make a statement like that, but that kind of gives you a feel of kind of what the sense was as far as manifest destiny and the move from the early settlers all across the country. I've also gone through, when we talk about Indian removal, rated the 5 people that probably had the biggest impact on Indian removal. And number 1 that I have up there is George Washington. George Washington kind of set the precedence for Indian removal, and he kind of made a statement that he was going to go through and negotiate with the Indians. If the Indians would not give up their land through the negotiation treaty, then he would go to war with the Indians. And most people don't talk about the 3 wars that George Washington headed up and while he was president. The first 2, he had a guy named General Arthur St. Clair, and George Washington was a land speculator, and he speculated in all these lands over in Ohio. He wanted Ohio to be opened up for English settlement, and so he tried to negotiate with the Miami, the Shawnee, and they wouldn't talk. So he sent his armies twice into Shawnee and Miami territory, and both of those armies were essentially annihilated. They just completely defeated the American army as they went in. And so he went to Congress and he said, look, if we're going to be able to open up the Ohio territory, I've got to have a well-trained army. And so he got Congress to approve 5,000 individuals. And there was a guy named Mad Anthony Wayne. That's the kind of title of a person you want to lead in your army, right? Mad Anthony Wayne. He took these 5,000 men and then trained them for 2 years at Fort Pitt, which we now know as Pittsburgh. Okay, on Indian warfare, on how to survive in the wilderness, so on and so on. And then they went and they attacked Miami and the Shawnee, and they ended up winning that war. And that opened up the old Ohio territory into for settlement for the English. So that was the first. Up until that time, George Washington, there had only been 7 Indian treaties the 200 years before. After he was president, he essentially tripled that amount of treaties that were signed as far as taking land from the Indians. Thomas Jefferson, with the purchase of the Louisiana Purchase, he was the first one that recommended to the Cherokee to relocate to Oklahoma. He said, look, as on voluntary, we're going to let you go and we'll grant you land in Oklahoma. And a large number did back in early 1800s migrate. That's part of the 1/3 that was over in Oklahoma. So Thomas Jefferson, he's actually the reason that Alabama became a territory in the state. He made an agreement with the state of Georgia that if they gave up rights to Alabama and to Mississippi, then he would remove all the Indians from Georgia. And Georgia said, yeah, we'll do that. And so, which he didn't remove them, but you had John Quincy Adams, who didn't like Indian removal. He was the one that removed the Creeks, and then Martin Van Buren was the one that removed the Cherokee from Georgia. So Thomas Jefferson comes in number 2. Ulysses S. Grant. Ulysses S. Grant had more Indian treaties, twice as many than any other president, almost 135 different treaties that he's signed with the Indians. I've got the last 2, Andrew Jackson, because of his support of the Indian Removal Act, and Abraham Lincoln tied for 4th. Abraham Lincoln, I'm not sure if you're familiar with the Long Walk with the Navajo Indians, but under his administration, he required all the Navajo Indians to move from Arizona up to the northeast part of New Mexico, and there were 7,500 of them. 3,500 died on that trip. But so that's what's called the Long Walk, and some of the information that we have on, and some of y'all may disagree with that, and that's fine. But every time I say Andrew Jackson was my favorite president, and people go, slave owner, and then the guy that did all the Indian removal. So you kind of have to understand the situation at that time. Thomas Jefferson also was one that, again, talked about Indian removal in the Declaration of Independence. This is a part that most people don't read on the Declaration of Independence. And he said in the Declaration of Independence that he, talking about the King George of Great Britain, has excited domestic insurrections among us and has endeavored to bring on the inhabitants of all our frontiers the merciless Indian savages whose known rule of warfare is undistinguished destruction of all ages, sexes, and conditions. Okay. Now what's he talking about there? Well, George Washington again sparked what was called the French Indian War that went through and created the 7-Year War between Britain and from France, and pretty much broke Britain during that contest that was there. And so they said, we don't want this sort of thing happening again. So we don't want the George Washingtons going across into Indian territory here and sparking another war, in Europe. So they came up with this proclamation line of 1763 when the Treaty of Paris, when that document was signed. And essentially they designated this area for the United States, or for the colonies, and this area was going to be all Indian territory. And it was illegal for English settlers to move across the line. This essentially goes up the Appalachian to move into Indian territory. And what Thomas Jefferson was talking about was people were ignoring that and going in, and the Indians were fighting back. So that's what he was talking about as far as the Indians were just protecting their land. But I tell people that I think that's probably the number one reason for the Revolutionary War. When you talk about the Revolutionary War, it was primarily a civil war that we had here in the United States. A third of the people were for independence. A third were to stay with Britain, loyal to Britain, and then a third didn't care one way or the other. They were just trying to survive and get along. So it was kind of a civil war that was going on here. And the main reason that the people that were for independence was that they could not settle into this Indian territory. They could not cross this line here, and they wanted the freedom to do that. You got to understand that the English population in America was doubling every generation. Okay, and we were basically a group of farmers, and they needed more land. And so that's why you had this migration into Indian territory they were talking about. Now, I kind of came to that conclusion, but I said, I'm not the smartest man in the world. I need to kind of verify that that's kind of the, so I contacted this H.W. Brands. If you ever go on C-SPAN, you'll see a lot of videos he does. He's the head of the history department over at the University of Texas. And I posed that question to him in an email. Now who am I? I'm nobody, right? And this is one of the premier historians in the United States. I was surprised when he wrote me back. And he said, yeah, I've taken a look at what you're saying, and I think that one of the main reasons for the Revolutionary War that we had was this proclamation line that was signed in the Treaty of Paris. So Manifest Destiny was one thing that, that we were very big on, that we saw the United States when they were formed, that they would migrate all the way to the Pacific Ocean. So, which is happened. But when you had Manifest Destiny, you had Indian removal. So if it hadn't happened, if there was no Indian removal, then the United States would look a whole lot different than it does today. Half of New York would be gone, half of Pennsylvania. You go down, half of Georgia would be gone. This was what the United States would look like if we hadn't had Manifest Destiny. Have I made anybody mad?
Well, I think there is another side. I mean, I wouldn't call the Indian savages. They were fighting for their own land.
Right.
And I mean, they had a whole different culture, but you see, it's a paradox.
Yeah.
And I mean, the British were known for going all over the world and building empires and destroying.
Yeah, I don't blame the Indians for fighting for their own land.
No, and I have cotton farmers who came on the Indian land in North Alabama, but I also have Cherokee ancestors who, some of them did for the white man and some did for their own land. I mean, you can see both sides.
It was a situation they were basically outnumbered. You look at the population in the southeast back in the before Indian removal, before 1830, you had 95% of the population were white settlers living on 50% of the land. You had 5%, which were Native Americans, living on the other 50%. So you can see the imbalance there. And it was just, to me, just a matter of time before, again, with their population decreasing because of disease and that sort of thing, and the United States population doubling every generation. It was just this explosion of people.
Do you know about the Osage Indian story? They took a bunch of them out to, well, first it was Kansas and they moved them into Oklahoma. I've forgotten the years, but there's a movie about to come out. There's a good book called Killer of the Violet Moon.
Yeah, the Osage and the Cherokee had conflicts with each other.
But the
too, I think,
Osage
right?
people were given this terrible land. This is part of the other side of the story instead of farmland. It's real rocky and all. Well, they discovered oil under their land, and they became the wealthiest people in the whole country.
Yeah.
And so all these white guys married into them and poisoned them and killed like 600 people to get their rights to the oil. I mean, it's a true story. This
Same thing happened with Cherokee out in Oklahoma. They found out that was oil rich out there.
Yeah, well, the Osage Indian is a true story. I've read, there's a really good book. There's also a movie starring Leo DiCaprio that's coming out.
The last thing I was going to talk about was Trail of Tears and the Cherokee removal that happened from 1837 to 1838. This is actually one, I worked with Butch Walker and Casey Reed. I don't know if you ever knew Casey Reed at Oakville Indian Mounds, but he's over in Florence now.
Okay.
But he was direct, he took over for Butch Walker. But we came up with these there's 4 of these signs that we came up with. 2 of them are mounted out in Point Mallard, and there's different trails that they have out there that dedicated to the Trail of Tears. One of the things that people talk about with the Cherokee removal back in 1837 to 1838 is the fact that there was probably 4,000 that died on that trip. There was 18,000 that were in this side of the Mississippi, and then another 9,000 or another third were over already in Oklahoma. And people talk, and it's stuff that's people teach in schools and everything about the 4,000. You hear it all the time, the 4,000 that died. What I did was go through and look at each of these. There was 26 groups that made the trip out to Oklahoma during the Trail of Tears. Okay, and the best I could come up with that there was only about 600 that passed away on that trip. Well, where did we get the 4,000 from? Well, there was a guy named Dr. Eliza Butler that was a missionary to the Cherokees in Georgia. And one of the things that he wrote in 1840 was that 4,000 Cherokees died during the Cherokee removal. Now, he was only involved in one of the trips out to Oklahoma, and I think there was only like 25 people that died in that trip on the way out there. But that number got published and circulated all over the United States, and that's what people say and use all the time. If you look in a 2-year period, what the average lifespan would have been, then during that time, 2-year period, you'd probably have 800 Cherokee that would have died during natural causes. So how many of that 600 that died was from natural causes, how much from actually the trip going over? But there was a number of different groups. I talked about Captain George Fields. He was one of the first. There was a group that they petitioned the government to move themselves. They said, yeah, we'll go to Oklahoma. You'll give us land out there. We'll go by ourselves. He was one of those that came. Then there was these voluntary army that people would sign up to go to the army to go. And most of these were by steamboat. That they would come down to Decatur, get on the train, go to Florence, jump on a steamboat, go up the Tennessee River, down to Mississippi and up the Arkansas River. And so there were a number of these, and they were mainly these voluntary groups that went. There was essentially very few deaths that occurred there. During 1838, after May of 1838, there were some of these forced army marches. There were 4 of those. First 2 went okay, but the other 2, there were some significant deaths. And so John Ross, who was the chief of the Cherokees, petitioned the U.S. government to look, I'll move the rest of the Cherokees. Just turn them over to me, I'll go ahead and I'll get them out to Oklahoma. And I'll do that if you pay me $60 a head. Wow. So once he got out to Oklahoma, they wrote him a check for about $500,000. But at $60 a head, he couldn't afford to send them by steamboat. So he forced them to go by land, to walk the whole way. So that was under him, and that's where most of the deaths occurred, from what I've been researching on these 26
Well, one of
different
the
groups.
Trail of Tears, I think there are 5 major ones, came from Fort Payne, crossed at Gunnersville, and went up to the Ohio and
Yeah.
Arkansas. Well, that was one of my ancestors, I just found out.
Oh, okay.
I mean, isn't that amazing that probably half the people in this room have ancestors. But he had white British settlers from Jamestown who married into the Cherokees.
Yeah. John Ross is not a big fan of mine as far as the Cherokee.
I've run across
He
this.
was, him and Major Ridge,
Yeah.
which Major Ridge was 7/8 Cherokee, 1/8 white. And
There's a lot of intermarriage.
John Ross was just the opposite. John Ross was 7/8 white
Yeah.
and 1/8 Cherokee. He couldn't even speak any of the Cherokee language.
Well, that's where Butch
John
Walker,
Ross.
he has a lot of books and history
Yeah.
about. I've learned a lot.
And where the real tragedy occurred is when John Ross showed up out in Oklahoma, the Cherokee out there had already set up a government. And John Ross says, hey, I'm here. I'm in charge of the whole Cherokee Nation now. And they go, well, no, it don't work that way, You'll have to get voted in to be, the president or the head chief of the Cherokee Nation. So he started a civil war out there. And so he killed Major Ridge, he killed Major Ridge's son, a number of, the real deaths that occurred out of that was when John Ross showed up and started the Civil War. And the Civil War went on for probably 10 or 15 years until President James K. Polk stepped in and said, look, John Ross, you're going to have to put an end to this. And we're not going to put up with this anymore. And that's when the Cherokee Civil War sort of ended.
So what is the point now for walking trail flat?
It's over close to, where the big amphitheater is. It's on past there. There's 2 trails. They were going to have 4 trails, and they really haven't kept the trails up. But there were 2 more signs and 2 more trails that were supposed to be developed out there, and they never. Those other 2 signs are sitting in a warehouse somewhere, never mounted up.
So like where the stage is that what you're talking about?
Yeah, on back the stage. It's over close to
the river.
Yeah, by the golf course over there. Is where it's
They're
at.
growing over, they're not really
Yeah, they're not.
used
So
to.
all they care about is that golf course, I think now.
But we had a big celebration when we put those up. We had
Yeah.
the head of
I
the
didn't know it,
Cherokee
yeah.
Nation that came here from Oklahoma and had a big ceremony that we had there. So it was
I would
kind
think
of
that there would, what do you think about deaths in some of the intern camps, for example, when they were clearing out East Tennessee and how they would move them into, temporary camps. That was
Yeah.
always such a problem. Even for armies, think about all the Mexican war soldiers who died of disease and even Civil War. I mean, it was just typical hygiene problems of those eras when you get large groups of people in the camp
Even the
situation.
Japanese internment, I mean,
Yeah.
there's been some bad
and
things over
even
that
that, from
history.
what I've researched on that, was a little bit over exaggerated. Do you think that they were all put into this little fort, all crowded up, like really what they did, they had location areas like around Fort Payne, around Chattanooga, that was probably the size of, old Decatur here, where the Indians would come and camp out and then they would move them on. So it wasn't like they were just, crammed into a little fort, but it could have been, the conditions could have been better
Think
for
about
them.
typhoid, dysentery, just kind of that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
Sanitation, but I
Yeah, most of them, now John Ross, when he migrated to Oklahoma, he didn't walk the whole way.
I know.
He came here to, his place was in Chattanooga, came through Decatur, went to Florence, and actually bought his own steamboat. And so him and his
He made
wife and
money.
about 100 others got on their own steamboat and they went. Now she actually died when they got to Little Rock, but that was because of disease she had, not from.
And it is true that a lot of the Indians when they had to get on the train because of the shoals,
Yeah.
they escaped into the Bankhead or Sipsey Wilderness Forest.
Yeah, especially over in Florence when they,
Yeah, but I heard in Decatur, I just read a story about that they had to put them in, you know, buildings and all, and then things happened and they were able to walk away.
yeah. Yeah, especially over in Florence, there was a large group that once they got to Florence, where they got on the steamboat
Yeah.
to go, they took off into the
But that's
Bankhead.
why there's so many in Lawrence County.
Judge Braylon's already talked about our history first. Dr. Carolyn Swoop is going to be next. And with that, I'll answer any questions. This is another picture of, my wife gives me a hard time about my eyebrows.
Oh, Lord.
Whenever-
Yes, a whole different category.
Whenever she does, I always show her these pictures. So,
Gives him a hard time over more than just that.
I wonder what heritage soda he is. He looks Scottish.
Scottish.
he had an interesting life. He ended up going to Mexico, was going to get oil out of pine trees. He had this weird idea. He ended up in a Mexican prison because he couldn't pay his bills, and his second wife, this was after Myrtle died, his second wife ended up finally, after 6 months negotiating, trying to get him back out of prison before he went back to Tulsa, Oklahoma. So he was a strange
Slide.
one.
I want to see the previous slide again. The list of speakers.
And there's another picture of Samuel Mosley in his old age and some of the artifacts that he had. Yeah.
Okay.
John Allison's got Miss Kate Lackner coming up, and then, why did we assign that to John Allison?
Yeah, I have no idea. He volunteered.
Is it gonna
I
be
told
PG
you
rated
before.
or what?
I have 2 words for that, human trafficking, and I'm done.
You got Pond Springs. Pond Springs, I haven't heard a lecture on it. That's going to be interesting. I don't know John Griffin.
He's the director over there.
Oh, okay.
Oh,
Good
okay.
director.
Which is,
So that'd be great.
used to be called the Wheeler Home, but
Correct.
that's why a lot of people don't
Yep.
know it.
Yep.
Peggy, and I don't know Andy Dye. Peggy Townsley knows. She's one of our movers and shakers, but Andy Dye, I'm not familiar with him.
I know Andy. Andy owns the
Main Street Antique Mall.
right, and then another shop in there as well. That is something a little different if you think about it. I think he's going to talk about. I'm going to encourage him to talk about things like how can you tell if something is antique or if it's a piece of junk, that kind of thing. Andy kind of specializes in local things. He loves to buy local antiques of all types. So I think that's going to be a pretty interesting talk. And I think we'll have a big crowd for that.
Well, we appreciate y'all helping keep our history.
You did a great job.
Well, we went over, I apologize for that. We went over about 30 minutes, so.
Guys, it gets even better because you showed up. We've got 2 things that are giveaways. One is about a 40-year-old print of the depot. It actually has the wrong date of construction here. This was actually built in 1905 and it has 1895 on it. This is about 40 years old. The library had a bunch of these and said, "Oh my gosh, we just found these. They were tucked away somewhere. Would you like to have these?" So they're available to you for free. And this is a 1996 print of the Olympic torch coming through Decatur on the way to Atlanta. Let's see. Yes, this young man, really young man right here is now Senator Arthur Orr. So these are on a really historic thing that we have here. This is something that I have on loan. It's mine, but I think it's pretty cool. It is an ice chest from the Buckeye Bottling Company, which was located where the Cook Museum is now. They actually bottled their own beer, their own whiskey, their own soft drinks, and then they became the Coca-Cola bottler here before Coke even had their own bottles. Coke didn't get their own bottles till after 1900, and Buckeye had the franchise to bottle Coca-Cola here long before that. So they actually had the Coke franchise. So anyway, there's an old box over here just before you go into the ticket room that has both of these on it, and you're welcome to pick up one or more if you wish to have them. And we love to see things that we hand out because they end up around town, framed in storefronts and houses and whatever. And that just we like to spread our history. So, boy, I tell you, Phil, I love having him because I learn from him every time he shows up. So, and that's the truth. He's a wonderful speaker and certainly well researched. And
Well, I hope y'all got your money's worth anyway.
it was worth exactly what they paid.